March 8, 1971, 7:30 p.m. A custom Rolls-Royce pulled up to Madison Square Garden. The driver opened the back door. Frank Lucas stepped out. He was 40 years old, 5'6". But when he stepped onto that sidewalk, he looked 10 feet tall. The coat, full-length chinchilla, light tan, custom tailored. It moved when he walked like liquid gold. $50,000 on his back. His wife Julie stepped out behind him. Mink stole. Diamonds. She looked like she belonged in Paris, not in Midtown Manhattan. They walked through the crowd. People stared. Photographers noticed. Flashbulbs popped. Frank smiled. This was exactly what he wanted. But this story doesn't start at Madison Square Garden. It starts 3 years earlier, in the jungle. Frank Lucas was in Bangkok, Thailand. He wasn't a tourist. He was building a drug empire. Frank had grown up in North Carolina, moved to Harlem in 19, worked for Bumpy Johnson for 15 years, learned the game from the best. When Bumpy died in 1968, Frank didn't inherit his operation. Nobody did. Bumpy's empire collapsed. The Italians moved in, and Frank Lucas, who'd been Bumpy's driver, was suddenly unemployed. But Frank had been watching, learning, planning. He'd seen how the drug game worked. The Italian mafia bought heroin from middlemen, Corsican suppliers in Marseille, Turkish connections in the Middle East. By the time the heroin reached New York, it had been cut and diluted so many times that it was barely 10% pure, and every middleman took a cut. Frank had a crazy idea. What if you eliminated the middlemen? What if you went straight to the source? The Vietnam War was raging. American soldiers were in Southeast Asia, and Southeast Asia was where the purest heroin in the world came from. The Golden Triangle, Burma, Laos, Thailand. Frank got on a plane. He met with suppliers directly, Chinese merchants who controlled the opium fields. He negotiated prices that the Italian mafia could never match, and he made a deal. He would buy pure heroin, 100% pure, ship it back to America himself, cut it himself, sell it himself. No middlemen, no mafia tax, complete control. The profit margins were insane. Frank could buy a kilogram of pure heroin for $4,000 in Bangkok. In New York, after cutting it, that same kilogram would generate $1 million in sales. The math was simple. The execution was genius. Frank created something he called blue magic. It was heroin, but purer than anything on the streets. 90% pure compared to the mafia's 10%. Addicts went crazy for it. Within a year, Frank Lucas controlled Harlem's drug trade. Within 2 years, he'd expanded to New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Connecticut. By 1971, Frank Lucas was making $1 million a day, every single day. He had 100 people working for him, his own suppliers, his own distribution network, his own cutting houses. He was invisible. The police didn't know his name. The FBI didn't have a file on him. The Italian mafia had no idea who was taking their customers. Frank dressed like a businessman, drove normal cars, lived in a modest house in Teaneck, New Jersey. He remembered what Bumpy Johnson had taught him. The loudest one in the room is the weakest one in the room. Stay quiet, stay invisible, make money. For 3 years, Frank followed that rule perfectly. Until the night of the fight. Frank had always been a boxing fan. Muhammad Ali versus Joe Frazier, March 8. The fight of the century. Both fighters were undefeated. Both were champions. Both claimed to be the greatest. It was the biggest sporting event in years. Frank wanted to be there, but more than that, Frank wanted to be seen there, because Frank Lucas had a problem. He'd made it. He was rich beyond his wildest dreams. He had money, power, respect in the street, but nobody knew. His mother back in North Carolina thought he was a limousine driver. His cousins thought he had a furniture business. The world thought he was nobody, and Frank Lucas wanted the world to know he was somebody. So he bought ringside tickets. Row 1, seat 7. $15,000 for 2 tickets, and he bought the coat, $50,000. Chinchilla, custom made by a furrier on Fifth Avenue. When the furrier asked what the occasion was, Frank smiled. "I'm going to sit with the kings." Julie, his wife, tried to talk him out of it. "Frank, that coat is too much. You're going to draw attention." Frank dismissed her concern. "Baby, I've been invisible my whole life. One night I want people to see me." "Frank, we've stayed safe by staying quiet. I'll be in a crowd of 20,000 people. Nobody's going to notice me." But Julie knew better. When you're the only black man in a $50,000 fur coat sitting ringside at the biggest fight in history, people notice. Frank and Julie arrived at Madison Square Garden at 8 p.m. The crowd was already buzzing. Celebrities everywhere. Woody Allen, Miles Davis, Norman Mailer, Dustin Hoffman, and mobsters, Carlo Gambino, Joe Colombo's crew, Philadelphia mob, Chicago outfit representatives. Frank walked to his seat, the coat flowing behind him. People turned to look. Who was this guy? Frank sat down, right at ringside, close enough to hear the fighters breathe. He spread his arms across the back of the seats, diamonds flashing on his wrist and fingers. The photographers noticed. Cameras started clicking. Frank smiled for them. This was his moment. The fight started at 10:30 p.m. It was brutal. 15 rounds of violence. Frazier won by decision, but Frank barely watched the fight. He was too busy enjoying being seen. By 11 p.m., photos of Frank Lucas in his chinchilla coat were being processed in newspaper darkrooms across the city. The next morning, the Daily News ran a photo spread of the fight. Page ringside glamour at the fight of the century. There was Frank, front and center, that coat impossible to miss. The caption read, "Unidentified fight fan enjoys the action in expensive seating." Unidentified. That photo reached 100,000 people, including Detective Richie Roberts. Richie Roberts worked in the Essex County Prosecutor's Office in New Jersey, Narcotics Division. He was 32 years old, divorced, living in a studio apartment in Newark, and he was known as the most honest cop in New York. 2 years earlier, Roberts and his partner had found nearly $1 million in cash in a mobster's car during a bust. Roberts had turned in every penny. His partner thought he was crazy. Other cops thought he was self-righteous. But Roberts didn't care. He had a code, and he followed it. On March 9, 1971, Roberts was eating breakfast in a diner when he saw the newspaper photo. The man in the chinchilla coat. Roberts stared at it. Ringside seats at Madison Square Garden. $15,000. That coat, probably 50 grand. The diamonds. The confident. Roberts knew every major criminal in the New York area. Every mob boss. Every connected guy. He didn't recognize this man. Roberts took the newspaper back to his office. He showed it to his colleagues. "Anyone know who this is?" Nobody did. Roberts called the NYPD, called the FBI, called the... "There's a black guy sitting ringside at the Ali fight in a $50,000 fur coat. Who is he?" Nobody knew. That bothered Roberts, because Roberts understood something fundamental about crime. You don't get rich in the underworld without someone knowing. The mob knew. The cops knew. The feds knew. But this guy, nobody knew, which meant he was either incredibly lucky or incredibly smart. Roberts decided to find out which. He started asking questions. Quietly. Who supplies high-end heroin in Harlem? Who's moving weight? Who's making real money but staying off the radar? It took 3 weeks. An informant, a low-level dealer in Newark, mentioned a name, Frank. Frank. Who? Just Frank. That's all I know. He's got the best dope. Blue magic, they call it. 90% pure. Nobody knows where he gets it, but it's everywhere. Roberts kept digging. More informants, more names, more pieces. Frank Lucas, from North Carolina, worked for Bumpy Johnson, now running his own operation. But nobody had details. No addresses, no photos, no evidence, just a name and a reputation. Roberts put together a surveillance team, 6 detectives. They started following leads. It took another 2 months before they spotted Frank. May 1971, Frank Lucas getting into a Lincoln Continental in Teaneck, New Jersey. Roberts watched through binoculars. That's him, the guy from the fight. From that day forward, Frank Lucas was under surveillance. Wiretaps on his phones, tracking devices on his cars, undercover officers watching his houses. Roberts built his case slowly, carefully. He didn't know it yet, but that photograph at the boxing match had given him everything he needed. A face, a lifestyle that didn't match any legitimate income. A target. Frank Lucas had no idea he was being watched. He continued operating, making money, expanding his territory, but he made another mistake. He kept being visible. He bought more expensive cars, a new house, threw parties. Every time Frank appeared in public, Roberts' surveillance team was there, taking photos, recording conversations, building the case. By 1973, Roberts had enough evidence to move, but he didn't want just Frank Lucas. He wanted the entire organization. Roberts convinced the FBI to get involved. Federal resources, federal wiretaps, federal prosecutors. They spent two years building an ironclad case, and on January 28, 1975, federal agents surrounded Frank Lucas's house in Teaneck. They knocked on the door. Frank answered in his bathrobe. "Frank Lucas, you're under arrest for conspiracy to distribute heroin." Frank didn't resist. He'd known this was coming. His lawyer had warned him months earlier that the feds were circling. But Frank had gotten arrogant. He thought he was untouchable. As the agents handcuffed him, one of them said something Frank would never forget. "Nice coat you wore to the Ali fight." Frank's face went cold. That coat, that one night, that one photograph. During the trial, the prosecutor used that photograph as evidence, not of the crime itself, but of the lifestyle. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this is Frank Lucas, on March 8, 1971, sitting ringside at Madison Square Garden, wearing a $50,000 fur coat. He claimed to be a driver. He claimed to run a small furniture business. The prosecutor pointed at the photo projected on a screen. "Does this look like a driver to you?" The jury deliberated for 6 hours. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced Frank Lucas to 70 years in federal prison. Frank was 43 years old. He would die in prison, unless he made a deal. Frank sat in his cell at the Metropolitan Correctional Center in Manhattan. 70 years. He thought about that night at the fight. How good he'd felt. How powerful. He thought about Bumpy Johnson's advice. Stay invisible. And he thought about how one moment of vanity had destroyed everything. A few months after his conviction, federal prosecutors came to Frank with an offer. "Cooperate. Give us names. Give us corrupt cops. Give us your suppliers. We'll reduce your sentence." Frank thought about it for 3 days. He'd been betrayed by his own ego, his own need to be seen. Now the government wanted him to betray others. Frank made his decision, but that's another story. Richie Roberts became famous for taking down Frank Lucas. He eventually became a defense attorney. Ironically, he defended criminals instead of prosecuting them. Years later, a reporter asked Roberts, "How did you catch Frank Lucas?" Roberts smiled. He caught himself. He wore a $50,000 coat to a boxing match and sat ringside. He wanted the world to see him. So he did. Frank Lucas served 15 years. Got out in 1981. Went back to prison in 1984 for a different drug charge. Got out again in 1991. He spent his final years giving speeches about his past, telling young people not to make his mistakes. He died in 2019 at age 8. When journalists asked him about his biggest regret, Frank always gave the same answer. That coat. That one night. I should have stayed home. Someone asked him, if you could go back, what would you do differently? Frank Lucas thought for a long moment. I would have kept dressing like a driver. I would have kept driving a regular car. I would have stayed invisible. Because the moment you show the world who you are, you give them a target. He paused. Bumpy tried to tell me, stay invisible, but I didn't listen. I wanted to be seen, and being seen is what killed me. The reporter asked one more question. Was it worth it? That one night of feeling like you'd made it? Frank Lucas shook his head. 70 years. They gave me 70 years. I sat in a cell, thinking about that coat, every day for 15 years. Was it worth it? He looked directly at the camera. What do you think? The story of Frank Lucas and the chinchilla coat became legend in law enforcement circles. Police academies teach it. FBI training uses it as a case study. The lesson is always the same. Criminals who want to survive stay invisible. The ones who want to be famous end up in prison. Frank Lucas wanted both. He got one. One last thing. The next story is about the choice Frank made in that cell. The choice that made him the most hated man in the underworld.